that accompany motions are recognised as well as they are in Parliament and in the legal profession. So if these motions are changed, and actually we've had a quick talk, and the board's here today, welcome these, Mr. Chair. I think this is a great step forward, and we appreciate the sentiment there. I do note that the money was not debt funded, it was cash that North Shore received from the sale of North Shore City Holdings Limited. It was a mixture actually of cash received from the sale of property, but also cash reserves held by that company. And the original resolutions of North Shore City was that that money be applied to community facilities within the North Shore City, and we still believe that that should be the case. So again, I welcome the resolutions there. We do note also that it doesn't mention, although it says that the funding for any other position would be found elsewhere, it doesn't mention the fate of the $3 million if that actually happens. So I welcome your comments that, if I've read your comments correctly, that your view is that they should be applied to community facilities within the old North Shore City area as well. And if that's the case, I'm sure the boards will be able to get together in a sub-regional collegial process and work that through. But I just wonder whether there should be a note to that extent, if that's the intention of the committee. I'm sure to be welcomed by the people of North Shore.
We believe G will cover that, because let's be quite clear, if Yachting New Zealand identify a site on the North Shore, that's what the $3 million we will raise. Yes, it's debt, but it is budgeted for, but that's what the $3 million would come from that fund. So it's a matter of, the issue G is covering the fact that, let's just say it ends up at Akarana, for example, then we would have to raise the money elsewhere. Sure.
And the question I have is then, what is the fate of that original $3 million if the funding for that is to be held elsewhere? And I think you covered that in your opening remarks, that it would be available to North Shore City boards that made up the former North Shore City
boards. I think that's the intention. I'm not hearing anyone putting up their hand to object to that.
Well, can I ask a question around it?
Yeah.
Sorry, I need to understand whether the $3 million was to support the development of a high-performance community sailing centre, or whether the $3 million was to support a community facility of some type in the North Shore.
Okay. So all the funding, and I've got the original minutes and agenda here, much to my surprise I kept them for other reasons actually, and I had a list of the projects there. So the history was that yes, North Shore City applied the full amount of the sale and the cash holdings to community facilities on the North Shore. Now, with the transition coming, there was a hold-up in some of the projects going ahead. The ATA determined that it was getting too close for some of the projects to be advanced, which left about $6 million unspent. So North Shore City applied those to the only other two projects, community projects that it could find in the long-term plan, one being the Millennium Centre and one being the Now Centre, and $3 million each. The interesting thing, and I know it's history, but history is important, is that because it was public money, there was a note made on both of those projects that there be a large percentage of community and public access to those facilities. One in the Millennium Centre for access to the pools at the same level and no greater cost than comparable public swimming pools in the North Shore. And the Now Centre was a percentage, and I can't recall the percentage, but my colleagues might, of community access to that centre as well. And so I think those sentiments should be applied. But primarily, it was community facilities in the North Shore City area. Secondly, the Now Centre was deemed to be a community facility that this could be applied for.
Right, so it's not for a Auckland-based sailing centre, so therefore it could be, for example, applied to the annual plan or the LTP for anything that the local boards on the North Shore want to do with regards to community facilities. And if that's the case, what are the criteria?
Mr. Chair, if I could just add to that, the conversations at the time were around the North Shore City Council at the time's contribution relating to the community component of the project, and the government's contribution would relate to the elite sports sort of extension opportunity, I guess. And that, I mean, bearing in mind it was quite a different proposition and has since evolved. It was going to be right next to the Takapuna Boat Club. It was going to just right next to where the playground is now that everyone knows about, and the pedestrian crossing that's coming. It would have been there. It would have been in place. There would have been the opportunity for the elite training, but there would have also been enhanced community access. There would have been better access to the reserve, because the boats that get rigged on the reserve currently would have been being stored out of sight in an underground bunker. So there'd been quite a lot of thought as to how do you provide for the elite, and that was the government's contribution, and provide betterment for the community access and the community who are accessing the reserve. So it was a combined project, but I'm very strongly of the belief that Council's contribution was intended to support the community component.
So, Mr. Chairman, supplementary, this paper is actually even mistitled. It's not funding for a high-performance community sailing centre at all.
Community facility.
It's funding of a community facility on the North Shore as per a pre-amalgamation agreement. I mean, we're not talking about yachting at all, are we? I mean, well,
we will ask the author of the report to come forward.
It was always both, and that's why the government were providing money.
Because I can't understand, since this council has been in operation...
Councillor Simpson, we're just going to ask Dean. Dean, could you come forward and just give us the background on this relating to 2012 and the Strategy and Finance Committee resolutions?
That's why it's called high performance and consistency. Sure. Thank you. So maybe it's worth me just giving a few introductory comments, because there's a fair bit of... there's a number of views around the table. So if you bear with me, Chair, are you okay if I just step through this?
No, I want you to step through it.
So look, just before I take things too much further, can I acknowledge David Abercrombie, who's the Chief Executive of Yachting New Zealand, and he'd be available to provide some further clarification around both the need for funding and the purpose of that, as well as Kevin Ramsey, who's assisted in preparing this report and has got the knowledge around the legacy funding and its purpose. So look, just so where do I think we're at? Clearly, the original proposal for Takapuna didn't go ahead, okay, and the community voted on that, and the proposal to develop that site was withdrawn. Having said that, the intention, as I understand it, of Yachting New Zealand and Sport NZ is still to develop a high-performance sailing facility and a community facility that allows people that enjoy yachting to use, okay? So it's a community facility with the purpose and intent is around both elite but also community-based sailing activities. So hopefully that goes some way to answering...
It is for sailing.
It is for sailing.
Right.
And if I listen into what I've learned around the original decision-making process, while sailing was a core intent, which was the government's funding, we also recognise, as we do with any of our funding from council, we've got community expectations and access expectations, which is why we would put our funding and try and match up in some way, shape or form. So where are we at? My take on where we're at is that the existing agreement, for all intents and purposes, has expired. So the point of bringing this paper today was that we have a point in time where we can renew the relationship intent under that agreement, and we can either choose or not. In the same way, for the relationship agreement, we can also choose to renew, in principle, funding to support that community and high performance investment. As I read it, the council's contribution of up to $3 million is critical for the project to go ahead. As I read it and I hear what has been described, that the intent of the legacy funds from the North Shore City Holdings was for a North Shore City, legacy North Shore City boundary project. So I understand that. So if Yachting New Zealand identifies a project outside of that old geographical boundary, then the resolutions provide for this. Then alternative funding from council, if it's to meet its $3 million contribution, would need to be found. The way that the memorandum of understanding has been written, or the relationship agreement has been written, it's got in that a number of clauses that go to what would qualify for us to even invest. And so in terms of business case expectations and the quality of that, being satisfied that the funding is available from sufficient funds overall. So the total development might be $7, $8, $9 million worth, depending on what the requirements are, of which we would provide 3. So that balance would need to be found for other sources. We would need to be satisfied that that funding would be available before we committed our $3 million. That the capital investment in its own right stacked up and met business case expectations, and that we received Crown sign-off through Sport NZ. We've got similar expectations around formal agreements with future users so that we can see that community access for facility is available, the business plan, all the regulatory approvals of which would be included community consultation. So the memorandum or relationship agreement sets out those expectations, which would need to be met, or a clear pathway to them being met before any funding was released. So the critical decision for this committee today, if I can sharpen it up, is do you wish to extend or renew that relationship agreement with Sport NZ and Yachting New Zealand for this type of facility? And secondly, do you wish in principle to support it with funding, whether it's in the North Shore City area, we know the source, or outside the legacy North Shore City area? Hopefully that's a snapshot summary that assists with the discussion to follow.
Yep, that does. Thank you, Dean.
Question, Mr. Chairman. So I get that. I think the two issues for me are: do we want a high-performance sailing facility in Auckland, and about the $3 million? The third thing I think that we need to consider is that I thought you said that the agreement from the North Shore City Council for that $3 million to be invested in the community facility has expired. Is that correct? So therefore, if it's expired, there isn't a relationship. I don't mean to be disrespectful.
I don't think that's what Dean said. What Dean said is the agreement with Yachting New Zealand has expired.
So I've just got a personal view on this. I think the relationship endured, but quite clearly the test for the funding had expired because the intent was that it would be invested in that location. That location isn't going to be invested in now, so, you know.
Right. I've got it now.
Mr. Chairman, if you remember, there's been a fraught relationship in a sort of... When it changed from that location to one in a different location, the whole argument became about the campground and not about the sailing centre. So that took up an awful lot of time and money. But it isn't, I have to be honest, it's not clear from the report whether the spark no longer exists at Sport New Zealand. You only talk about 2 parties in your resolution. If it's actually a memorandum of understanding between 3, it should say so in the resolution.
The original memorandum had several parties, and one of them was the Harbour Access Trust. This one is between Council and Yachting New Zealand, so it's changed. And it's become simpler in that respect.
Because they burned the spark money.
And sorry, this has just been. Is the government money still there?
Burned it, haven't they?
Sorry, pardon me.
It's gone mostly, isn't it?
We can ask David, but 3 million is a substantial component to it. So my feedback from David, and he can talk to this shortly if you wish to bring him up, Chair, but the 3 million is a critical component as to whether the funding will be released from the government. They would like to see us support it in cash and in kind.